Every story has a villain, but not every villain is simple. Welcome to Dark Character Profiler, the podcast where we examine fictional characters through psychology, trauma, and moral fracture. Here, we go beyond good and evil to ask harder questions. What shaped them? What broke them? And at what point does survival become monstrosity? I'm your host, Fulcrum. Let's begin.
Dark Character Profile.
Listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussions of severe psychological trauma, violence, abuse, and exploitation. All analysis is presented for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional diagnosis, psychological treatment, or medical advice. The material is examined analytically and without glorification, but it may still be distressing. If you need to pause, skip, or step away, please do so.
Dark Character Profile.
The first thing I notice when I open Darth Plagueis' file is how little noise surrounds him. No spectacle, no theatrics, no hunger for recognition. Where other Sith announce themselves through violence or conquest, Plagueis works in silence, in laboratories, in boardrooms, in the long, careful manipulation of systems that outlive individual lives. Most people know him only through a story, a parable delivered in the dark by a man who already understood the power of suggestion. But Darth Plagueis was never meant to be a myth. He was a method. A being who believed that the universe itself could be trained, disciplined, and corrected, not through passion, but through mastery, not through rage, but through control so complete it resembled inevitability. This is not a story of a man who wanted to live forever out of fear. It is the story of a mind that could not tolerate randomness, a mind that looked at death, chance, and limitation and saw not mystery, but inefficiency. Tonight, I'm opening the file on Darth Plagueis to understand what happens when intelligence replaces faith, when control replaces attachment, and when the pursuit of mastery over life itself costs the very thing it claims to preserve. Background information. Plagueis does not begin as a Sith. He begins as Hago Damask, a moon born into a species already synonymous with financial precision and institutional influence. Moons are raised inside systems of leverage. They are taught early that power is rarely loud. It is structured. Damask excels in that environment, not merely in commerce, but in architecture. In understanding how institutions breathe, how markets react, how debt becomes dependency and dependency becomes obedience. Before he ever touches the dark side, Damask already believes something dangerous, that systems are superior to individuals. It is this quality, not rage, not desperation, that draws the attention of Darth Tenebris. Tenebris does not seek passion in an apprentice. He seeks precision. He recognizes in Damask a mind that already views the galaxy the way a Sith should, not as something to conquer violently, but as something to restructure quietly. Under Tenebris, Damask is introduced to Sith doctrine, and it does not feel like corruption. It feels like confirmation. The Sith reject submission to balance, they reject natural limitation, and they reject the idea that destiny outranks will. For Damask, this aligns perfectly with what he has already learned through finance, that control is possible, that systems can be engineered, and that outcomes can be shaped long before anyone notices. And here is where the banking clan becomes more than background detail. As Damask rises within the InterGalactic Banking Clan, he does not treat it as cover. He treats it as a laboratory. Through credit manipulation, investment channels, and political leverage, he begins shaping entire sectors of the galaxy without drawing a blade. Governments bend under debt, corporations rise and fall through liquidity, and political outcomes shift through quiet pressure. This becomes rehearsal, because if economies can be stabilized or destabilized at will, then perhaps biology can too. If political systems can be engineered, perhaps the force can be disciplined the same way. When Damask becomes Darth Plagueis, it is not a fall into darkness. It is the merging of two philosophies: financial systems mastery and Sith metaphysical ambition. He does not abandon one for the other. He fuses them. The banking clan teaches him that power scales through infrastructure. The Sith teach him that even existence itself may be infrastructure. And once those two beliefs connect, mortality begins to look like just another inefficiency waiting to be corrected. Embodiment, canon, and interpretation. Before we move deeper into Plagueis' psychology, we need to address something that shapes audience expectations before a single word is spoken: his body. In the Darth Plagueis novel, Plagueis is a Mun, and Muns have a very specific physical profile. We've seen their physiology clearly established in Star Wars: The Clone Wars and Star Wars Episode 2: Attack of the Clones. They are extremely tall, have severely elongated skull structure. They are gaunt, angular, and architecturally austere. Luceno's Plagueis matches this description: a being whose physical form reinforces emotional restraint and cerebral dominance. He does not look theatrical, he looks surgical. However, the brief visual depiction in The Acolyte presents a figure that does not clearly reflect established Mun physiology. The silhouette and proportions differ from what we have consistently seen Muns look like across canon appearances. Why does this matter? Because embodiment influences psychological framing. If Plagueis appears as something other than a Mun, something less elongated, less severe, the audience subconsciously shifts how they interpret him. Amun's physical austerity mirrors Luceno's portrayal: disciplined, detached, mathematically cold. A different physical form suggests a different psychological texture. For this analysis, we are anchoring to the depiction found in the Luceno novel and the established Mun physiology seen in prior canon material. We are examining the architect, not the shadow. Trauma history. Plagueis' trauma is not rooted in deprivation or humiliation. It is rooted in exposure. He witnesses early on that power is arbitrary, that lives rise and fall based on chance, biology, and politics rather than merit, that even the most intelligent beings are subject to decay, betrayal, and death. For a mind like Plagueis's, this is intolerable. His trauma expresses itself not as fear, but as rejection: rejection of randomness, rejection of emotional dependence, rejection of mortality as an acceptable outcome. Rather than forming attachments, Plagueis forms theories. Rather than grieving loss, he studies it. Rather than submitting to uncertainty, he dissects it. Over time, this creates a profound psychological imbalance. A man who understands life intimately, but refuses to participate in it emotionally. Every experiment, every manipulation of the Force, every calculated intervention into political or biological systems is an attempt to close the gap between control and chaos. And yet, the closer Plagueis comes to mastery, the more isolated he becomes. not because he is rejected, but because nothing and no one is ever allowed to be equal. By the time Plagueis believes he has conquered death itself, he has already amputated the parts of himself that might have recognized what that victory cost. Mental state. When I picture Plagueis in his active years, the period where his theories begin to succeed and his influence quietly reshapes the galaxy, I picture a mind operating in near total stillness, not calm, not peace, stillness born of restraint. Plagueis is not emotionally volatile. He does not oscillate between extremes. He does not act out of impulse or passion. His mental state is defined by radical emotional austerity. He experiences emotions, but he treats it as interference, something to be observed, regulated, and minimized. Where other Sith draw strength from passion, Plagueis draws strength from distance. He believes clarity requires detachment, that mastery requires insulation, that attachment introduces variables that compromise control. This creates a mind that is exceptionally focused and profoundly narrowed. Plagueis does not struggle with reality testing. He does not misperceive the world. He understands it too well. What he cannot tolerate is uncertainty. When confronted with randomness, death, betrayal, unintended consequences, his response is not grief or anger. It is escalation, refinement, further experimentation. The more unpredictable the universe proves to be, the more aggressively Plagueis attempts to discipline it. This creates a closed internal loop. If control increases, the system is working. If control fails, the model is incomplete. If someone resists, they are a flaw to be corrected. There is no space in this framework for humility, only iteration. Plagueis's mind does not fracture, it calcifies. By the time he approaches what he believes to be mastery over life and death, he is no longer asking whether something should be done, only whether it can be optimized. Fulcrum's personality breakdown, the hurricane scale. Before assessing Plagueis's personality traits, it is important to frame his emotional climate. Category 1 starts as subtle wins and manageable emotions, all the way through Category 5, which is total internal upheaval. Plagueis's emotional weather is deceptively quiet. There are no visible storms, no obvious chaos. But beneath the surface is a pressure system so tightly controlled that when it shifts, it does so with catastrophic precision. Here's how Plagueis registers on the hurricane scale. Imagination and insight. Category 5. Plagueis's insight is extraordinary. He sees patterns others miss in biology, in politics, and in the Force itself. He does not imagine futures emotionally. He models them. His imagination is not creative in the expressive sense. It is architectural. He envisions systems that can be stabilized, variables that can be eliminated, and outcomes that can be engineered. This level of insight gives him an almost surgical relationship with reality, but it also removes friction, and friction is often where ethical hesitation lives. Control and order, Category 5. Control is not a desire for Plagueis. It is a requirement. He structures every aspect of his existence, his environment, his relationships, his experiments, his long-term plans, to minimize unpredictability. Where others accept limits, Plagueis treats them as design flaws. Loss of control does not frighten him. It offends him. When something resists mastery, he does not withdraw. He recalibrates and tightens his grip. This is the core of his psychological hurricane, not chaos, but over order. Social energy, category 1. Plagueis expends minimal social energy. He does not seek connection, he seeks utility. Relationships are instrumental: alliances, apprentices, financial ties, all governed by function rather than affection. This is not social anxiety or withdrawal. It is deliberate exclusion. The fewer emotional bonds Plagueis forms, the fewer variables exist that could destabilize his work. Compassion and cooperation. Category 1. Compassion is not absent in Plagueis. It is deprioritized. He understands suffering. He simply does not treat it as a deciding factor. If alleviating pain aligns with long-term control, he may act. If causing pain advances mastery, he does not hesitate. Cooperation exists only when it improves efficiency. Once it stops doing so, it is discarded without sentiment. Unpredictability, category 2. Plagueis is not chaotic. In fact, he is one of the most predictable minds imaginable, so long as you understand his priorities. He will always choose control over connection, systems over individuals, and outcomes over process. What makes him dangerous is not volatility, but consistency. When Plagueis surprises others, it is not because he's changed. It is because they misunderstood how little human cost factored into his calculations. Moral beliefs. Darth Plagueis' moral code is not absent. It is instrumental. Plagueis does not divide the world into good and evil, right and wrong, light and dark. He divides it into functional and inefficient. To him, morality is not a guiding principle. It is a variable that must justify itself. Life has value only insofar as it can be preserved, extended, improved, or controlled. Death is not sacred. It is not tragic. It is a technical failure. This is where Plagueis diverges sharply from both the Jedi and the Sith who follow him. The Jedi accept death as part of balance. Most Sith rage against it. Plagueis does neither. He rejects death as unnecessary. His belief system is built around a single organizing conviction that intelligence should outrank nature. If suffering exists, it is because the world is flawed. If people die, it is because the Force has not yet been mastered. If chaos persists, it is because sentimentality has been allowed to interfere with design. Plagueis does not experience moral conflict when he experiments on life. He experiences intellectual focus. The harm he causes is never framed as cruelty, only cost, a regrettable but acceptable expenditure in the pursuit of mastery. He does not see himself as evil. He sees himself as responsible. Responsible for correcting a universe that allows randomness to masquerade as destiny. Relationships. Plagueis' relationships are defined less by emotion than by function. Each connection exists to serve a role within his long-term architecture. Affection, loyalty, and intimacy are not goals, they are risks. Apprentices, including Palpatine. Plagueis' relationship with his apprentice is not paternal in the traditional sense. It is curatorial. He selects, cultivates, and shapes with deliberate care. Knowledge is given incrementally. Autonomy is allowed only when it increases effectiveness. Where other Sith dominate through fear or passion, Plagueis dominates through access. He controls information, he controls timing, he controls the scope of what his apprentice is allowed to understand. This creates a relationship built on asymmetry. Plagueis believes mastery requires hierarchy. Equality would dilute control. Trust would introduce unpredictability. Ironically, this same structure plants the seed of his downfall. By treating his apprentice as a component rather than a partner, he fails to account for ambition as an independent variable. The galaxy at large. Plagueis does not form relationships with societies or cultures. He interacts with systems. Governments are tools, corporations are leverage, bloodlines are experiments. The Force itself is a resource to be optimized. This distance allows him to operate without remorse, but it blinds him to emergent variables. Individuals are dismissed. Consequences are abstracted. What Plagueis fails to recognize is that systems composed of people do not behave like equations forever. Historical parallels. Plagueis' psychological profile closely mirrors real-world figures whose pursuit of mastery, optimization, and control eroded ethical boundaries without triggering emotional instability. First, we have Fritz Haber, a chemist whose innovations fed millions and killed thousands. Haber believed scientific advancement justified any outcome. Progress excused destruction. Intellect absolved consequence. Plagueis reflects this same calculus. Life preserved through control, life destroyed through experimentation, both justified by the belief that intelligence outranks morality. Next, we have Robert Oppenheimer. Not in guilt, but in detachment. Oppenheimer oversaw forces he understood intellectually long before he grappled with their moral weight. Plagueis similarly advances knowledge faster than ethics can follow. The consequences exist, but they are deferred. Someone else's problem somewhere down the line. Next is Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie believed optimization and progress justified exploitation. Efficiency mattered more than individual suffering. Legacy outweighed cost. Plagueis shares this belief system, but applies it not to industry, but to life itself. Next, we have Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov did not hate his subjects, he reduced them. Living beings became data points. Responses became predictable outputs. Plagueis approaches the Force and life the same way, not as mysteries to respect, but as mechanisms to condition. And finally, we have Joseph Stalin in his early technocratic phase, not for brutality, but for systems thinking. Early Stalinist ideology emphasized control, centralization, and optimization of outcomes over individual life. Plagueis mirrors this logic stripped of politics. Order enforced through systems, not sentiment.
And now, the final analysis. But first, just a little house cleaning.
Before we examine the crimes and potential diagnoses, a brief reminder. This analysis is presented for educational and entertainment purposes only.
Dark character profile.
Criminal behavior. Darth Plagueis' criminal behavior does not present as chaos, violence, or spectacle. It presents as systemic manipulation. Plagueis does not commit crimes for adrenaline, territory, or domination in the conventional sense. His criminality is embedded in long-term orchestration, political interference, financial manipulation, biological experimentation, and force based violations of life itself. Where others commit crimes within systems, Plagueis commits crimes against the idea of natural limits. His behavior escalates in three distinct phases. Phase 1, Instrumental Crime. In the earliest phase, Plagueis' actions are precise and contained. Before Plagueis violates life directly, he masters systems indirectly. Through the InterGalactic Banking Clan, he manipulates markets, destabilizes institutions, and engineers political outcomes without firing a weapon. Financial systems become his proving ground. If economies can be shaped, then perhaps biology can as well. Control at scale becomes rehearsal for control at existence level. These behaviors are framed as preparation rather than wrongdoing. To Plagueis, laws are not moral structures, they are inefficiencies created by lesser minds. At this stage, harm is minimized not out of compassion, but out of optimization. Noise attracts variables. Variables introduce risk. Phase 2, Experimental Crime. As his mastery of the Force deepens, Plagueis' criminal behavior shifts from manipulation to violation. He experiments on living beings, interferes directly with life, death, and biological processes, treats sentient existence as a controllable system rather than an ethical boundary. This is not impulsive escalation, it is methodical progression. Ethics are not debated, they are bypassed. Life becomes data, death becomes feedback, failure becomes refinement. Phase 3, Existential Crime. In the final phase, Plagueis' criminality becomes philosophical. By the time Plagueis approaches what he believes to be mastery over life and death, he is no longer operating from fear. He has succeeded. He has extended life, manipulated midichlorians, stabilized power structures, and engineered political momentum. And perhaps most importantly, he has become extraordinarily difficult to kill. Plagueis does not fall in combat. He does not lose to superior force. His apprentice, Darth Sidious, does not overpower him through dominance. He waits. He studies. He chooses timing over strength. The fact that Sidious must rely on intoxication, lowered guard, and psychological manipulation reveals something crucial. Plagueis was not weak. He was formidable. He had mastered so much that direct confrontation was no longer viable. This is not the fall of a careless mystic. It is the assassination of a system architect who believed he had eliminated unpredictability. And in that final moment, the one variable he underestimated was ambition born under his own tutelage. Psychological testing. If Darth Plagueis underwent modern psychological testing, the result would reveal a mind defined by extreme cognitive control, emotional suppression, and an ideological fixation on mastery. Trauma and stress response, moderate to high, cognitive pattern. Plagueis does not display classic trauma reactivity. Instead, stress manifests as intensified need for control, increased detachment, further suppression of emotional input, and escalation of experimentation. Stress does not dysregulate him, it narrows him. Impulsivity, very low. Plagueis is among the least impulsive figures imaginable. Decisions are slow, actions are deliberate, and outcomes are modeled far in advance. When he takes risks, they are calculated, not emotional. Empathy, intact but functionally inhibited. Plagueis understands suffering. He simply does not allow it to alter decisions. Empathy exists cognitively, but is overridden by outcome prioritization. This is not cruelty, it is instrumental disregard. Moral reasoning, severely abstracted. Plagueis reasons morally at the level of systems, not people. Individual harm is justified if the model improves. Ethical limits are dismissed as intellectual fear responses. Moral hesitation is treated as inefficiency. Grandiosity, intellectual, not performative. Plagueis does not seek admiration, he assumes superiority. Grandiosity manifests as belief in intellectual primacy, conviction that he alone can correct the universe, and dismissal of natural limits as ignorance. This is not ego inflation, it is epistemic absolutism. Identity stability, rigid but narrowed. Plagueis's identity is stable, dangerously so. He defines himself entirely through mastery. There is no redundancy, no alternate self. If control fails, identity collapses. Diagnostic breakdown. Everything we've discussed so far tells us how Plagueis behaves. Now, we need to understand how those behaviors translate psychologically and where they fall within modern clinical frameworks. For our first diagnosis, we have obsessive compulsive personality disorder. The DSM 5 TR requirements are a pervasive pattern of preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and mental or interpersonal control at the expense of flexibility and openness. Criterion 1: preoccupation with details, rules, and systems. Plagueis structures every aspect of existence around control, optimization, and predictability. Criterion 2: perfectionism interfering with completion. He continually refines experiments rather than accepting natural limits. Criterion 3: excessive devotion to work and productivity. All aspects of his life are subordinated to mastery and experimentation. Criterion 4: inflexibility about morality or ethics. Ethics are overridden by system efficiency and outcome optimization. Criterion 6: reluctance to delegate unless others submit exactly. Knowledge is withheld, autonomy is tightly controlled. Criterion 8: rigidity and stubbornness. Plagueis rejects alternative worldviews entirely. Plagueis meets 6 out of 8 criteria for obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Thus, this diagnosis is appropriate. Next, we have delusional disorder, grandiose type, late stage. DSM 5 TR requirements: presence of one or more delusions lasting at least 1 month with relatively preserved functioning. 1. Grandiose belief is unique mastery over life and death. Plagueis believes he has surpassed natural law. 2. Reality distortion without hallucinations. He reframes evidence to protect belief, not through psychosis, but conviction. And 3. Preserved functioning outside belief system. He remains rational, articulate, and organized. Darth Plagueis qualifies for a diagnosis in delusional disorder, grandiose type. Next, we have narcissistic personality features, subclinical. Plagueis exhibits sense of intellectual superiority, entitlement to control outcomes, and dismissal of others' limitations. However, he does not require admiration or validation. Thus, traits are present, but the criteria for full narcissistic personality disorder is not met. And 4. Moral injury, clinical concept. Plagueis repeatedly violates foundational ethical principles regarding life and autonomy. Symptoms include ethical disengagement, rationalization, identity overintegration with harm, and absence of corrective guilt. Thus, moral injury is applied as clinical conceptualization. Final impressions. When I close Darth Plagueis' file, what remains is not fear. It is absence. The absence of attachment, the absence of uncertainty, the absence of anything that might have slowed him down long enough to ask whether mastery was worth the cost. Plagueis did not seek immortality because he feared death. He sought it because death represented disorder, a flaw in a universe he believed should function cleanly under intelligent control. Where others cling to life, Plagueis attempts to own it. He does not rage against fate. He redesigns it. He does not grieve loss. He corrects it. And in doing so, he removes himself from the human equation entirely. Plagueis is not undone by arrogance in the traditional sense. He is undone by over-success, by believing that understanding a system grants the right to dominate it, by mistaking knowledge for wisdom, by assuming that mastery eliminates vulnerability. In the end, Plagueis does not fail because his theories were wrong. He fails because he treated life as a problem to solve rather than a condition to participate in. He conquered death in theory, and in doing so, he made himself replaceable in practice. Because a system built on control alone has no protection against betrayal. And a man who eliminates every variable eventually forgets that people are not equations. Darth Plagueis does not fall because the Force resists him. He falls because he built a world where nothing was allowed to love him back.
Dark Character Profiler.
Dark Character Profiler is produced and edited by Fulcrum under Dark Fulcrum Media. If you enjoyed this episode, consider following the show or sharing it with someone who loves psychology, storytelling, and morally complex characters. You can find links, references, and related material in the show notes. Until next time, remember, the most terrifying monsters are rarely born. They're shaped.
Thank you for listening to Dark Character Profiler with Fulcrum. Listen every other Tuesday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Podcasts. Humanity was not meant to live this way. Society is left to the mercy of murderers and cutthroats. Hear Paige Zaplin Dam's epic tale brought to life in an audiobook.
For years, Slade had felt secure in the forest.
I am from simple, humble beginnings. I was raised in the Ironwood by an ogress, an Anaral.
He saw immediately that she was beyond a healer's aid. Even a skilled witch could not help her recover from losing so much blood. Mother?
Slade thought he wanted revenge. Instead, he got redemption. A kingdom of ash and steam, The Ogress's Son, a dystopian neo-Dark Age fantasy, narrated by Rich Frazier. Now available on iTunes and Audible.
I promise you I will find whoever did this and avenge you, Mother.